Ethan, please, don't challenge him.
Trust me.
You're hiding something.
What is happening to my fleet?
Maybe you should have listened before threatening my husband.
You dare speak to me like that?
Who are you, really?
The man who married you.
You risked everything for me?
The wedding ceremony lasted 47 minutes and produced no significant incident. The reception was a different matter entirely. Marcus Cole stood at the edge of the viewing gallery on Thyron Imperial Station Vailketh, holding a glass of something amber-colored that the attendant had assured him was ceremonial and not in the traditional sense. Alcoholic. The station's main gallery had been configured for the occasion. A pressurized atrium 5 kilometers in diameter with a full 360-degree view of the Thyron home system. All three of its sons arranged in a triangular formation that the cultural briefing had identified as deeply auspicious. Several hundred guests from across the galactic assembly were arranged throughout the space in clusters organized by species and alliance, which Marcus had been studying quietly for the past 22 minutes with the focused attention of a man reading a tactical map. He was officially the diplomatic consort of Princess Varys of the Thyron Imperial House. He was, by every credential submitted to the Galactic Assembly's roster, a senior diplomatic consultant on secondment from Earth's Department of Interstellar Affairs. He had a badge that said so. He had business cards. He had attended all 3 cultural orientation sessions provided by the Thyron Welcome Protocol Office and thanked the instructors afterward with the appropriate level of sincere warmth. None of this was why he was watching Count Essel move through the crowd with the particular body language of a man who had somewhere important to be and was working very hard not to appear to know it. Essel was third cousin to the Imperial House through a line that had lost political relevance 3 generations back. His invitation to the ceremony was a formality, the kind that got extended because the logistics of identifying and excluding the peripherally important were more trouble than simply including them. His current trajectory toward the refreshments table where Marcus's glass had been sitting, untouched, for the past 39 minutes was something else. He moved through the crowd at the pace of someone who had a destination but didn't want it observed. He spoke briefly to 2 attendants as he passed them. He did not stop to greet any of the other guests, which was unusual for an event where greeting other guests was the primary activity on offer. Marcus picked up his glass. The Count arrived at his position with a deep and formal bow, left hand pressed to his chest in the Thyron gesture. For greeting equals, which was technically a social promotion, Marcus had not been offered by most of the other attendees this evening, though he hadn't mentioned it. Colonel Cole, or perhaps I should say Prince Consort. The occasion calls for the fuller title. Bioluminescent patterning sat at the ivory neutral register that Thyran xenobiology identified as social engagement. Nothing in the patterning was unusual. The ring on his left inner hand was unusual. An amber signet worn in the inner position, which Marcus's 14-month study of Thyron cultural practice had identified as the ceremonial position of severance. End rites. Final gatherings. The mark appeared twice in the publicly accessible cultural database, once in the context of death ceremonies, and once in the context of a specific pre-imperial legal tradition involving the formal severing of obligations. The complete cultural file, which existed under a restricted classification that had nonetheless been accessible with the right approach to the Thyron academic database, mentioned a third context. It did not dwell on it. "Congratulations on the ceremony," Marcus said pleasantly. "I understand the triangular solar alignment won't occur again for 17 years. He raised his glass toward Essel in the gesture of shared acknowledgement. "I was just about to sample the honor wine. Will you join me?" He reached past his own glass to the tray beside him and lifted a fresh one, a glass that had come up from the kitchen level 12 minutes ago, that had been on the tray rather than on the ledge, that had not been sitting unattended in an open gallery for the duration of a wedding reception. Count Essel went several shades paler than his natural ivory coloring. The luminescent trace along his upper cheekbones dimmed by approximately 40%, which was a stress response Marcus had read about but not previously seen demonstrated in person. It was, he noted, fairly unmistakable. "I'm afraid I have other guests to greet," the Count said. His voice held together well. He was a composed person under ordinary circumstances. "Of course," Marcus said. He took a sip from the new glass. It tasted of overripe pears and something metallic that was probably the environmental processing system. He watched Essel retreat toward the far end of the gallery and settled back against the viewport frame. Attempt number 1. 31 minutes into the reception. Unaginative, which meant either that the count was operating without much preparation time or that the method was considered reliable enough not to require creativity. He was mildly curious which. The second attempt, 40 minutes later, had more structural elegance. A uniformed escort from the station's diplomatic hospitality staff, the Thyron designation translated approximately as ceremony shepherds, a role that existed to ensure high-value guests moved between spaces without needing to navigate on their own, appeared at Marcus's side with a warm and professional expression and an offer to show him to the private ambassador's viewing suite, where he could enjoy the remainder of the evening in comfort appropriate to his new station. The suite existed. He had verified its location on the station map. It was a real amenity, not an improvisation. This was structurally a better plan than the Count's. Marcus fell into step beside the escort with gratitude. They moved through the connecting corridor between the main gallery and the north ring, which was the standard route between the two sections of the atrium. Marcus had walked every publicly accessible corridor on Valenketh in the 48 hours before the wedding, partly because he was thorough and partly because he had found that walking the physical space of a place before he needed to operate in it was the most reliable way to understand it. He had noted during that exercise that the connecting corridor between the gallery and the north ring showed a heat signature differential visible under standard thermal analysis. Approximately 12 degrees Celsius warmer in a 4-meter section near the midpoint than in the rest of the passage. This was consistent with either a recent repair of a pressurization fault or a deliberate modification of the atmospheric system for a specific near-term purpose. It was the kind of detail that appeared in footnote 3 of the Valenketh Station Safety Certification filing, which was available in the public galactic database under infrastructure documentation. "I actually think I'd prefer to stay in the main gallery for a little while longer," Marcus said, slowing. "I haven't had a chance to speak with the Deltharian delegation yet, and I believe their senior observer is in the East Wing." He looked at the escort with an expression that combined apology with mild social anxiety. Would that be possible? The escort's professional expression held for 2 seconds longer than it would have if the request had been routine. "Of course, Prince Consort. Allow me to redirect. Please don't trouble yourself," Marcus said. "I remember the route." He reversed direction, walking back toward the gallery lights. Behind him, after a pause of approximately 4 seconds, he heard the escort make contact with someone on a communication device. The timing was interesting. Not immediately. After he was already walking away, which meant the contact was informational rather than directive. Someone receiving an update, not giving one. That said something about the chain of command involved. The third attempt arrived 20 minutes later in the form of a ceremonial gift from a consortium of 7 minor houses, delivered in the traditional presentation format, a carved case carried by 2 attendants, accompanied by a formal recitation of the gift's provenance and the honor represented by its presentation. The case contained a ceremonial blade in a jeweled sheath. This was standard practice for significant wedding gifts in Thyran tradition. Marcus accepted the case, thanked the attendants with the appropriate depth of bow, and lifted the blade from its sheath with the careful reverence appropriate to receiving a significant gift from a significant gesture. Thyran ceremonial blades came in 2 forms. Left edge blades, with the cutting edge oriented toward the body and the blunt spine outward, were worn in peace gatherings as a display of trust, of deliberate vulnerability accepted. Right edge blades with the cutting edge facing outward were associated in the cultural record with a specific and different kind of ceremony. The complete cultural file described this ceremony in 2 sentences and then did not elaborate further. The blade in his hands was right-edged. Half a dozen representatives of the Minor House Consortium were watching him with very careful expressions. One of them, he noted, had shifted his weight toward the exit 3 seconds ago and hadn't shifted back. Marcus turned the blade so the jeweled hilt caught the light from the gallery's accent panels. The workmanship was excellent. Whoever had commissioned it had not cut corners on the material. "This is beautiful," he said, with genuine appreciation, because it was. "I noticed the cutting-edge position. Is that traditional for the formal giving ceremony? Or is it specific to this house's practice?" He asked it with the particular quality of academic curiosity that he had developed over many years of working in environments where asking dangerous questions with academic curiosity was the difference between a conversation and a confrontation. The silence that followed had a specific texture. He had encountered this texture before in conference rooms and debriefings, and once in a shipping container on a moon he was not officially supposed to be on. It was the silence of a plan encountering a variable it had not been built to handle. "It is a regional variation," said the eldest of the consortium representatives, with the composure of someone who had prepared for many responses and was deploying the most neutral available. "We apologize if it creates any ambiguity." "Not at all," Marcus said. "I'll treasure it." He sheathed the blade and tucked it under his arm and went to get another glass of the pear and atmospheric processing wine, because he was thirsty and the evening was long. He kept the blade. Real knives were better than decorative ones in his experience, and the jeweled sheath was going to be useful when he needed to look like someone who owned decorative things. Varys found him 20 minutes later at the viewport, looking out at the triple sun arrangement with his drink, and the expression that she would spend the next several months learning to read. The Thyran cultural briefing on human facial expressions was not adequate to the specificity of this particular face. She approached without announcement and stood beside him looking at the same section of viewport he was looking at, and neither of them spoke for a moment. This was the first time they had been alone since the ceremony. She had been watching him for the past 2 hours without being obvious about it, which was a skill she had developed early in life and exercised constantly in the course of her work. "Count Essel left the reception early," she said finally. "I noticed. The ceremony shepherd from the second ring corridor has been reassigned to the service level for the remainder of the evening." "That seems reasonable. The Draven Minor House Consortium," she said, "appear to have misplaced their gift presentation case." "I have it," Marcus said. "I'll return it after the reception." She was quiet for a moment that was not quite comfortable, and not quite uncomfortable, but had a quality she could not easily categorize. "Then your diplomatic file lists you as a mid-tier strategic consultant with 11 years of interstellar affairs experience, no field operations background, and a specialty in trade agreement mediation." She paused to let the statement sit. "That file's not accurate." "Most diplomatic files aren't," he said. "Inaccurate in one direction or another." "I've studied your species for 4 years," she said. "I have read every publicly accessible document produced by or about Earth's government and its diplomatic corps in the past half-century. In 4 years of study, I have never encountered any record that would explain what I watched you do this evening." She finally turned to look at him directly. It was a direct look, not aggressive, not particularly warm. The kind of look that expected something accurate in return and was prepared to wait for it. He met it. He said, "I read everything? Everything publicly accessible, and some things that weren't." She waited. He turned to look at her, and in the exchange of that look was something she had not expected and could not immediately classify, the quality of a person who had decided to give her something real. Not complete, not unguarded, but not the performance she'd been watching for the past 2 hours either. "Your Highness, I want you to know that the things I came here to do are not intended to harm the Thyran people, or you specifically." He paused. "I understand that's not particularly reassuring, coming from a man who just survived 3 attempts on his life at his own wedding reception." "No," she said, "it's not particularly reassuring." She looked back at the viewport. "We have a contract to sign in 18 minutes. The formal compact. I would like to know what to expect." "Formalities," he said. "Nothing unusual." He finished his drink and set the glass on the ledge behind him. "I'll need a few minutes to review the final language before signing. I hope that won't be an inconvenience." "No consort has ever requested that before," she said. "I imagine that's true," he said. The formal signing took place in the Treaty Hall, a chamber designed with the specific intention of making binding agreements feel permanent. The walls were thick. The ceiling was high. The table at the center was cut from Thyran heartstone, quarried from the Emperor's ancestral continent, and was considered under imperial law to be legally synonymous with imperial territory. Praetor Yen presided, a lean, precise individual whose career had been built on the premise that legal language meant exactly what it said, and that the person signing it understood this. The compact ran to 7 sections and 4 appendices. Marcus read it. The praetor stood with the patience of a man who had conducted this ceremony many times, and who understood that humans were known for their deliberateness with written agreements, which was something the Thuran court had been briefed on as a cultural note before the first negotiations opened. He was reading longer than the cultural note had suggested was typical, but the praetor was a patient person. Marcus reached Appendix 7. He read it twice. Then he said, "Praetor, I believe there's a translation issue in the 7th appendix, subparagraph 3. He indicated the passage. "The Galactic Standard rendering reads, 'In accord with current charter provisions, But the sort language here is referencing the original High Covenant framework, which predates the current charter by approximately 4,000 years. The correct translation of the source term would be in accord with all charter provisions, including those recognized under the original covenant of high blood. The distinction is significant for legal precedent. He set the compact down and looked at the praetor steadily. I took the liberty of drafting a corrected version when I reviewed the preliminary text last week. Would you like to see it? Praetor Yen took the handwritten page that Marcus offered. He read it. He read it again. He looked at the 7th appendix of the compact. He looked at Marcus. The specific range of color his bioluminescent patterning moved into at that moment was one Marcus had not been able to find in any cultural database, which suggested it was a range that did not occur frequently enough in diplomatic settings to have been documented. The language was accurate. The source text said what Marcus said it said. The praetor had no legal basis to refuse a correction that was technically correct and had been submitted before signing. The amendment was initialed, the change confirmed under the emperor's judicial seal, and the compact signed by all parties. Marcus signed his name in full, not the abbreviated form he used for internal documents. The complete legal signature, the one that appeared on everything that mattered. 3 hours later, as Varys was making her way to her private chambers, Counselor Death appeared at her side, with the controlled expression of a man who had discovered something that needed to be communicated carefully. He had served the imperial house for 30 years and had the specific gift of knowing when to pull a conversation out of the corridor and into a quieter space, which he did now by the simple expedient of steering her through a side door into one of the station's secondary observation lounges. He said, "I need to speak with you about the 7th appendix." She waited, he said. "I had the legal archivist pull the original source text after the signing. The amendment your consort submitted is legally sound. The translation was accurate." He paused. "The concern is this." The passage he cited, Covenant of High Blood, Section 12, Subparagraph 3, has not appeared in any legal or diplomatic document produced in the last 1400 years. It was last invoked in the pre-imperial period, before the current dynasty, before 3 emperors and 2 complete reformulations of the Galactic Charter. It is not referenced in any publicly accessible Thyron legal text published in the last millennium. It is not in any database that Earth has been granted access to under the Contact Protocol. He looked at her with the measured steadiness of a person who had made a career of not panicking and found it useful. He did not find it in any record we can account for. He found it somewhere else. And he read it with sufficient fluency in the original language to produce a legally binding amendment that our own legal bench accepted. Varys stood in the lounge with this information for a moment. Through the viewport, the 3 sons were in the late configuration of their triangular arrangement. The auspicious one, the one that occurred once every 17 years. The ceremony had called it a good omen. She was currently uncertain what to make of omens. "Keep this between us," she said. "For now." Death bowed. She went to her chambers. She did not sleep for several hours, and when she did, it was not the sleep she had planned for this particular evening. 3 weeks after the wedding, Marcus Cole had established a reputation in the Theron Imperial Court for 2 things: a breadth of knowledge of Theron legal texts that made the court's archivists quietly uncomfortable, and a habit of appearing at every function the court produced, wearing the same expression, attentive, pleasant, and revealing nothing in particular. He attended every session of the court's advisory panels without being asked. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his contributions took the form of questions about protocol, about legal precedent, about the historical basis for current practices. These were the questions of a newcomer learning the customs of an adopted court. They were asked with the genuine curiosity of someone who found the subject intrinsically interesting, and they were asked so consistently, across so many sessions, that the advisors and legal staff began to expect them and to prepare, before each session, for the particular angle that this human was likely to approach things from. He was, in their collective assessment, thorough, possibly overly so, but thorough was a quality the Thyron court respected, so they tolerated it. Varys watched him. She watched him the way she had spent 4 years watching the documentary evidence of his species before this assignment, methodically, with the scientific discipline of a researcher who understood that pattern recognitions required patience and a resistance to arriving at conclusions before the data supported them. She was a xenobiologist. She knew what premature conclusions cost. 3 weeks in, she had arrived at 3 conclusions that the data now supported. First, Marcus Cole had not come to the imperial court as a diplomat. Second, he was extraordinarily skilled at appearing to be one in the specific way that required both genuine preparation and a natural aptitude for presenting a controlled surface. Third, whatever he was doing, the preparation for it had begun long before the formal marriage proposal, which meant that either Marcus had predicted the proposal would happen, or that he had arranged, through some channel she had not yet identified, for it to happen. She had not concluded which. She had also not concluded what to do with any of these observations. This was unusual for her. She was not, as a general rule, a person who sat with undecided information for long. The undecided quality of this particular situation was something she found herself returning to, in the way she returned to a calculation that kept producing an answer that didn't fit the equation. She found him one morning in the secondary archive room. This room was technically restricted access, a research space used by the legal staff for primary source consultation. Requiring authorization from the Praetor's office or equivalent, he had, when she checked, requested access from Praetor Yen directly. Yen had neither granted nor denied the request in writing. He had told her, when she asked, that it had seemed less complicated to allow it than to create a formal record of the question. Marcus was at one of the reading consoles with a physical volume open beside him. Physical volumes in this archive were the oldest documents in the collection, the ones the digitization project of 3 centuries ago had been unable to convert without error, due to a translation protocol that rendered approximately 4% of Old Thyran idiom incorrectly. He was reading from one of these volumes and cross-referencing it with something on the console and making notes in a small bound notebook in a script she needed a moment to identify. Then she identified it. He was making notes in Old Thyran, in his own hand, in the original script, not a transliteration. She sat down across from him without announcement. He looked up and was not, she noted, particularly startled. "You have authorization for this room?" she asked. "I asked Praetor Yen," he said. He closed the physical volume with the care of someone who had been handling primary sources for long enough to make it automatic. He seemed to feel that creating a formal denial on record would raise questions he didn't want to answer. "That's not exactly authorization." "No," he agreed. "It's adjacent to it." He set his notebook to one side. On the spine of the volume he had been reading, she could make out the Old Thyran title, a compendium of civil covenant law from the pre-imperial period, which had been in this archive for approximately 600 years, and which, she was fairly confident, had not been removed from its shelf in at least 2 centuries before this morning. "How was the morning advisory session?" he asked. "You were there," she said. "I meant from your perspective." She studied him. Then she said, "What are you reading?" "Covenant law," he said, "the pre-imperial framework." The legal architecture shifted considerably when the current dynasty was established. Much of the earlier material was preserved in form, but substantially modified in application. It's a common pattern in legal transitions. The language remains. The meaning drifts. He picked up his notebook and put it in his jacket pocket, which told her the conversation was currently in a mode he considered active rather than casual. "Was there something you needed, Your Highness?" "I need you to tell me what you're doing," she said. "Not in general, specifically. What are you looking for in those records, and what do you intend to do with what you find?" He looked at her for a long moment. In the archive room's quiet, she could hear the soft mechanical hum of the station's environmental system working through its cycle. His expression was the same as always, attentive, controlled, but she had started to develop, through the practice of watching him very carefully, a reading of what existed underneath it. There was something ongoing there, always, something that kept its own counsel and had learned, over a long time, not to surface without reason. "Something that might be useful later," he said. "If things develop as I expect them to." "And how do you expect them to develop?" "Not particularly well for a while," he said, "and then better." He stood, tucking the notebook more securely into his jacket. "I have a session at 9th hour. I shouldn't be late." She let him leave. She remained in the archive room for a while after, looking at the volume he had been reading. She did not touch it. She did note the position of the ribbon marker he had left, and she noted the page number, and she noted the section of the text that was visible through the marker's edge. Then she returned the volume to its shelf and went to her own sessions. The Galactic Assembly held its monthly plenary in the 3rd week. Valeketh Station maintained a dedicated assembly chamber built to the standardized galactic specifications, a circular room with tiered seating arranged by species block affiliation and a central speaking floor accessible to any recognized delegate. Theron held 7 voting seats on the assembly. Marcus, as consort to a high blood member, had the right to address the assembly once per session in an advisory capacity, a provision included in the peace compact as a gesture of symbolic inclusion toward Earth. The gesture was understood by everyone to be exactly that. Previous diplomatic consorts from non-member worlds had used the provision to offer greetings, to thank the assembly for its welcome, to say things that could be received with polite appreciation and then filed under ceremonial record. Grand Admiral Cathon sat in the Thyron delegation's primary tier in full dress uniform. He was a tall individual with the spare, angular build that characterized the Northern Thyron genetic line, and the specific quality of stillness that came to senior military officers after enough years of learning to control what their bodies communicated. He had been reviewing Marcus's diplomatic profile for the past 2 weeks with a thoroughness that he had not explained to his aides and that they had learned not to ask about. He had also accessed, through his own authority and without creating a formal record in the standard intelligence log, the preliminary contact assessment that Thyron's intelligence division had produced on Earth's diplomatic representation before the wedding. The assessment described Marcus as a moderate unknown. In Cathon's experience, moderate unknown was not a low-risk category. It was the category that warranted continuous monitoring. Marcus took the speaking floor when offered it. He thanked the assembly chair. He did not produce a prepared statement. He began to speak in the way of someone who had thought about what he wanted to say for a long time and was now saying it directly. He talked about death. He said, "I want to describe something specific about my species because I think it's the most important thing to understand about what Earth's membership in this community would mean. From the time a human child is old enough to understand the concept of permanent absence, which, in the developmental literature, occurs somewhere around age 4 or 5, they are told that they will die, not as a threat, not as a mystery to be deferred, as a fact of existence that can be known and lived with." He paused, letting the translation array complete its rendering cycle. Every culture Earth has ever produced, across every continent and every historical period, has placed the question of death at the center of its creative and philosophical work. More human writing, more human music, more human visual art has been produced in response to mortality than in response to any other single subject. We build monuments to the dead. We tell stories about the dead. We build entire systems of belief around the question of what happens after death, because the alternative, simply not addressing it, does not appear to be something the human mind is capable of sustaining for long. The assembly chamber was quiet in the way that meant people were processing, rather than waiting for an opportunity to speak. "I want to be specific about why I'm telling you this," Marcus continued, "because I understand it may read as a kind of performance, or as an attempt to make something that might seem like a liability into an asset. I'm not doing that. I'm describing the functional reality of what my species has become as a result of this history." He looked out at the tiered seating with the unhurried directness of someone who was not performing confidence but simply had it. Every human soldier who has gone into combat has at some level made a calculation about the possibility of not returning, not unconsciously, not as a thing they push away and ignore, consciously, explicitly, before they go. Every explorer who has flown beyond charted space has done the same. Every doctor who has walked into an epidemic zone, every engineer who has certified a structure to be tested past its known limits, they have all, in some form, accepted the possibility of their own death as a relevant variable in the decision they are making. And then they have made the decision anyway, not because they are reckless, not because they undervalue their own continuation, but because they have been prepared culturally, from childhood, over many generations, to function in conditions where that variable is present and active. He gave the translation array another moment. Then, what the Galactic Assembly's current assessments identify as human instability and unpredictability is the behavior of a species that has spent its entire existence optimizing for conditions of maximum uncertainty. We are not reckless. We are the product of a culture that has run for several thousand years the mental exercise of accepting the worst possible outcome and deciding to proceed anyway. What I am asking this body to consider is whether that capacity, that particular, difficult, inconvenient human capacity, constitutes a danger to galactic order. He paused, or whether it might be something else. He thanked the chair and returned to his seat. The chamber's response ranged from open hostility to something that, in certain configurations of expression, looked like the early stages of a realization that the person speaking had just described something they had encountered before and not known how to name. Cathon, in the upper tier, had the expression of a man running a recalibration he had not scheduled. The question period offered several challenges. Marcus answered them one at a time, with the specificity of someone who had prepared for them. In the middle of a response to the Deltharian delegation's senior observer, he said something about the threshold concept, what your term veil captures so precisely. The moment of first understanding across a categorical divide, and then stopped. Shifted his phrasing. Continued with a different formulation. Nobody in the chamber caught it. The translation array rendered veil as first threshold, which was its standard diplomatic gloss. Varys, in the Thyran delegation tier, caught it because she knew, from 4 years of xenobiological research, including Thyran linguistic material, that veil had a second historical meaning, not first threshold. The pre-diplomatic usage, the one that appeared in classified contact documentation under protocols that were not accessible without authorization. She knew this because she had the authorization and had used it 3 years ago as part of a research project on contact encounter documentation across galactic species. She had found the word in 3 documents. All 3 were classified. All 3 described the same kind of event. She looked at Cathan. His expression had not changed, but she saw his left hand, resting on the arm of his seat, close into a fist and then deliberately, consciously open again and rest flat. That evening, leaving the assembly chamber, she passed close enough to Cathan and his aide to hear 2 words of what they were saying. Cole, and then, a half-second later, veil. She went back to her chambers. She sat at her archive terminal for a long time without typing anything. Then she pulled up the search interface for the classified contact archive, a system she had access to through her xenobiological research authorization, which she had never used for anything except species behavioral documentation. She typed the query carefully, veil contact record classification alpha restricted. The system asked for confirmation of her royal authorization seal. She sat for a moment with her hand over the confirmation input. Then she confirmed it. The file the system returned was 47 pages long. It had been filed under seal by Grand Admiral Cathan's personal authority 7 years ago. She began to read. She read for 2 hours. The file used operational language. This was standard practice in military documentation. A vocabulary of parameters and vectors and objective completion rates that was designed to describe events with sufficient precision for analysis while maintaining sufficient abstraction for deniability. The language removed the people from what had happened to them. It converted them into data points. It converted decisions into technical actions and consequences into acceptable operational parameters, and 11 human deaths into a notation at the bottom of a methodology section. Varys read it through twice. The first time to understand what it said. The second time to understand what it meant. 7 years ago, Grand Admiral Cathan had ordered a mission designated as a Class 7 pre-contact capability assessment under Provision 12 of the Galactic Contact Protocol. The mission had been authorized through Cathan's own command authority. It had not been reviewed by the Assembly's Contact Oversight Committee, which was standard protocol for non-passive pre-contact operations. It had not been submitted to the Emperor's Security Council, which was standard protocol for any military operation in an unregistered contact zone. These omissions were not noted in the file as departures from procedure. They were simply absent, which was a different kind of notation. The mission had made active contact with a human outer colony installation. The file's description of the contact event ran to 6 pages and used the term capability response assessment to describe what had happened. The colony's defensive systems had engaged. The mission personnel had exchanged fire with those defensive systems for a period of 11 minutes, after which the mission had withdrawn. The colony's defensive response was assessed as exceeding pre-contact capability projections by a factor of 3.7, which the file's analytical section described as significant. 11 colony personnel had died in the engagement. The file noted this in the methodology section, in the same register as the mission timeline and the capability assessment results. 6 weeks later, the Thyran Empire had opened formal peace negotiations with Earth. The file did not connect these events. It did not need to. The timeline did it clearly enough for anyone who read both documents together. She pulled the parallel files, the Thyran military movement records from that week, the peace negotiation timeline. She laid them against each other in her research interface and read them as a single narrative. The structure was clear and simple and terrible. A secret act of aggression, an unexpected defensive response, a calculation that the situation had become more complicated than the original risk assessment had projected, and a political solution that would remove the threat of the humans knowing what had happened to their people while also classifying the information under a seal that only an Imperial officer with Cathan's authorization level could open. She sat at the terminal until the station's environmental system cycled to the overnight configuration. Then she went to find her husband. Marcus was in their shared quarters at the writing desk, with the bound notebook and 2 of the physical volumes from the archive and the compact open beside them, all cross-referenced in the way she was beginning to recognize as his working configuration. He looked up when she came in, and in the fraction of a second before he composed his expression to its default, she saw something that she did not have a name for yet, not surprise, not guilt, something more complicated and more quiet. She placed the decoded file on the desk between them. She placed it carefully with both hands, the way she placed specimens when precision of positioning mattered, she said. "You know what this is?" He said yes. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "Before the wedding." She pulled the chair out from the desk and sat down. He had been about to suggest it. She thought the gesture was already forming, and she chose to preempt it because she needed to be in this conversation on her own terms. She said, "Tell me." He told her about his team. He didn't open with the incident. He didn't lead with Kepler Station or with the operational file or with the 11 dead understood as an abstraction. He led with the people, one at a time, in the order they occurred to him. He described Sergeant Okafor with the specificity of a man who had thought about the person many times, heavyset, who had a paperback book in every pocket and a photograph of his 2 daughters taped to the inside of his helmet in a position where nobody could see it except him, because the photograph was not there to be seen but to be known about. He described Lieutenant Chen, who made the worst coffee that anyone on the team had ever encountered and who brought it to every briefing without fail and apologized for it every single time, not because anyone had asked him to stop or continue, but because the apology had become part of the ritual, and the ritual had become part of how they operated together. He described Specialist Ruiz, 19 years old, who had joined the Outer Colony Defense Program because she wanted to see what was beyond the established transit lanes and had been told this was the fastest route to finding out. He described all 11, not as a list delivered collectively, one at a time, with the particular details, the photograph, the coffee, the 19-year-old's specific and named ambition that separated a person from a data point. His voice did not change while he was doing it. It held the same register throughout, level, precise, clear. The voice of a man who had recited this particular accounting to himself so many times that the reciting of it had become something between a wound and a discipline, something he had learned to carry with him the way you learn to carry weight over a long enough distance that the weight became part of how you moved. When he finished, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He set it on the desk without unfolding it. He said, "Their names, in case I need you to understand what I'm referring to at some point." She looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. She asked, "Why did you come here?" "Because every alternative Earth had available in the past 7 years ends in one of 2 places," he said. "Escalation or permanent standoff. Neither of those gives 11 families any kind of answer. Neither of those makes it impossible for the next person in Cathan's position to order the next Veil mission and bury it under the same protocol seal." He paused. "This was the only option I could find that had a different endpoint. You manipulated your way into my court," she said, not as an accusation, as a statement of fact that required confirmation before she could proceed. "Yes," he said. He did not qualify it. "I argued for this assignment. I told Earth Command that a physical presence inside the Thyran court was the only leverage that couldn't be answered with a carrier fleet. I also told them it was a good-faith diplomatic mission." He paused. "Both of those things are true simultaneously." She said, "What did you put in the contract?" He looked at the compact on the desk open, to the section he had been reading when she came in, with the ribbon markers and the handwritten marginalia in 2 scripts. He said, "Something that makes it very difficult for Cathan to do what he's going to try to do next, which is to have me removed from this court before I become a problem. And if he does it anyway, then the right to petition under the covenant passes to you," he said, "as the high blood party to the compact. If you chose to use it, you'd have the standing to bring everything in that file in front of the full assembly. Under your royal seal, in open session." He looked at her directly with the quality of a person being as precise as they are capable of being. "I was not planning to tell you that. I was hoping it would remain a contingency that never needed to be activated." The room was quiet for a moment that had a specific texture, the quality of a truth that had just arrived in full and that had too much weight to be immediately moved. She said, "You used me. I built a plan that required you as a contingency," he said. I understand that is not meaningfully different from using you, but I want to be accurate about the structure of it. She stood up. She went to the viewport. This room had the same view as every room on the station, the same arc of stars and the home system's orbital paths, which she had looked at her entire life and had never thought about in quite the way she was thinking about it now, as a backdrop to a conversation that kept producing information she had not prepared for. She stood looking out for a while. She asked, "How long did you spend preparing for this?" "The legal work." 18 months, he said, the language longer. "I started on Old Thyran 3 years ago." She thought about what that meant, 3 years ago, before the formal contact protocol between their species had produced anything resembling a framework for a diplomatic marriage, before the event that would eventually make the proposal possible had even occurred. A human being had begun learning a dead language that had not been spoken colloquially in over a millennium, in preparation for a situation that did not yet exist, on the probability that it would. She tried to map this onto any framework she understood for how people allocated the resource of their time, and found that the framework kept producing an error. She said, "I need to think." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not going to report this to my father tonight." He said nothing. She was aware of the specific quality of his silence, the silence of someone choosing not to make audible the reaction they are having, because making it audible would be inappropriate to the moment. She had started to develop a vocabulary for his silences. She went to her room. She ran the decision tree the way she had been trained to do since childhood, in the precise analytical structure that her father's advisors had identified early as her strongest cognitive faculty. Every branch that involved reporting Marcus to the imperial court ended in the same place. The veil file would return to seal. Cathan's version of events would become the official record. 11 families would go on not knowing. She kept encountering this outcome at the end of every branch that looked like the correct political decision, and she kept finding that she could not build past it in the direction she had been trained to build. She was still at her desk at the 3rd hour of the overnight cycle when she noticed the page on the desk that had not been there when she sat down. A single sheet, handwritten in Galactic Standard, not in Old Thyran, not in his own language's script. In the language they both read easily, 11 names, below them, in the same hand. "In case something happens to me, these names belong in the public record. If you're reading this and I am not able to speak for myself, you will know what to do." She sat very still. She held the paper with both hands and sat with it the way she had learned to sit with information that her frameworks were not immediately adequate to process. She was a scientist. She knew what trust looked like as a behavioral signal. She had studied it across 40 species in controlled and uncontrolled conditions. She had never received a trust signal that looked precisely like this, 11 names left on a desk without announcement, by a man who had calculated that she was his best available contingency, and who had decided in the same calculation that she deserved the actual truth of what that meant and the choice of what to do with it. She put the paper in the inner pocket of her robe, not in a drawer, not in the archive, on her person. She was not fully certain why, but she understood that the decision had already been made and that the making of it had not required nearly as much deliberation as she would have expected. She did not sleep well. She did not report anything. In the morning, Counselor Death came to her with something from the document monitoring system, a notation of activity in the primary archive during the overnight cycle. She told him to note it and stand by. He gave her the look she knew well, the look of a man who had followed an instruction he disagreed with and would not say so more than once, and withdrew. She spent that day reading the same pre-imperial legal texts that her husband had been reading. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. By the end of the day, she understood the Covenant of High Blood, Section 12, subparagraph 3, with sufficient precision to have an opinion about it. Her opinion was that it was a more significant provision than anyone had understood when the dynasty was established, and the old legal framework was preserved in form without being fully examined. Provisions like this tended to accumulate significance quietly, over centuries of non-use, until the moment someone looked carefully enough to find them. She thought about what it would take to be the kind of person who looked that carefully, that consistently, for 3 years, for a situation that didn't yet exist. She thought about the 11 names in her pocket. She thought about the specific question of how you spent your time when you had decided, at some level she did not yet fully understand, that your own continuation was not the primary variable in the calculation. The summons arrived at the 7th hour, a formal notice, sealed under the Grand Admiral's military authority. convening an emergency security session of the Imperial Court. Cathan's right to call such a session was established in the governing compact's military provision. In the recorded history of the court, this provision had been invoked 11 times. 7 of those invocations had occurred during active wartime. The remaining 4 had involved threats to the emperor's physical security. The formal notice described the current grounds as a credible threat to the security and integrity of the imperial court from within. Varys read the notice in the doorway of her chambers, death waiting at her shoulder. She read it once. She folded it. She said formal attire, full court. She went inside to change. And while she was changing, she moved the folded paper with 11 names from her robe pocket to the inner pocket of her formal dress, where she had a reasonable certainty it would remain on her person, regardless of how the morning developed. The chamber was the inner court, not the public assembly chamber, but the sealed space where imperial authority operated without galactic oversight, the room where things were decided rather than announced. The emperor sat at the head under the seal of the house. The legal bench occupied the right tier. The witness gallery above was occupied by senior advisors and military staff. Cathan stood at the center floor in full-dress uniform, which he wore in the manner of someone who had thought about what wearing full-dress uniform said about a situation before deciding to say it. Marcus sat to Varys's left in his position as consort. He was wearing the same suit he had worn to the wedding reception. She had the distinct impression, looking at him, that he had been awake for some portion of the night making calculations, and that the calculations had arrived at a place he was comfortable with, not because the place was good, but because it was known. He had his jacket on. The notebook was in his inside pocket. He had not, as far as she could see, brought anything else. Cathan spoke for 24 minutes. He was professionally organized. He presented Marcus's actual service record, not the diplomatic file, which had been submitted to the Assembly's roster in the normal manner, but the classified record, which existed under the Galactic Contact Protocol's security provisions, and which described Marcus Cole as a strategic operations architect within Earth's defense planning structure. He had held this classification for 9 years. The role it described, designing and coordinating Earth's long-range strategic deterrence planning, was the highest civilian military intelligence position Earth's government maintained. It was not a diplomatic position. It had no diplomatic equivalence. It was what it said it was. Cathan presented the Intelligence Division's assessment of what this meant. Marcus had entered the imperial court under false credential representation, with the intention of establishing a position from which to conduct intelligence operations, with the marriage as cover. This was, under the Galactic Contact Protocol security provisions, a violation of first contact engagement standards. He recommended, with the precision of someone who had drafted the recommendation in advance and was now reading it into the formal record, that the marriage compact be declared void, that Marcus be expelled or detained as appropriate to the security determination, and that Earth's government face formal censure before the Assembly for sanctioning an intelligence operation under the cover of a peace compact. He finished. The Emperor looked at Marcus. Marcus said, "Everything the Grand Admiral just presented is accurate." The murmur that moved through the court was a specific kind, the sound of a room that had braced for denial and encountered something it had not prepared for. Cathan, to his credit, absorbed it without visible change in expression. He had prepared for many responses in the overnight hours, and this was among them. He let the surprise settle and waited. Marcus said, "I am who he says I am. I came here for the reasons he suspects. I won't insult this court by pretending otherwise." He looked at the Emperor steadily. "I would like to read one paragraph from the marriage compact before this court makes its determination. The compact that bears your imperial seal, Your Majesty." He paused. "I believe it's directly relevant to the proceeding." The Emperor looked at Praetor Yen, who said, in the measured tone of a man choosing each word, "The compact is a legal document under imperial seal. Any party to it holds the right to reference it in a formal proceeding of this nature." His patterning was at the ivory neutral register. He looked like a man performing neutrality with some effort. "Proceed," the Emperor said. Marcus opened the compact to the 7th appendix. The amended version, the corrected translation, initialed by Yen and confirmed under the Emperor's judicial seal at a wedding reception, now 3.5 weeks ago, while the guests were drinking honor wine and Count Essel was leaving early. He read from it in Old Thyran. The translator array took it clause by clause into Galactic Standard, the Covenant of Blood. Section 12, subparagraph 3. A provision of the pre-imperial civil law framework, established at the founding period of Thyran civilization. and preserved through the transition to the current dynasty, in the specific way that legal language sometimes preserves provisions that have outlived their context, not through active intention, but through the inertia of comprehensive documentation. Preserved but not annotated, preserved but not referenced. Present in the base text the way structural elements remained in a renovated building, technically load-bearing, functionally invisible, significant only if someone went looking for it. The provision stated, should the party of high blood initiate dissolution of the marriage compact on grounds not formally recognized under the current Galactic Charter's peace provisions, the non-native spouse retained full right of petition before the Galactic Assembly in open session, including the right to submit historical conflict documentation for formal review by the Assembly's Record Committee. Marcus read it clearly, no emphasis. The register of a person reading something that said what it said and did not require performance. Then he set the compact on the table and said, Praetor Yen confirmed the translation accuracy at the time of signing. The Emperor's judicial seal confirmed the legal validity of the amendment. The compact has been registered with the Assembly's treaty archive since the signing date. He looked at Cathon for the first time since the session began. Grand Admiral. 7 days after the wedding, Princess Varys accessed the Veil contact file from the classified contact archive. She accessed it under her royal authorization seal. Under Thyran evidentiary protocol, that access event is a formal legal record. It is time-stamped. It cannot be unmade or retroactively reclassified. If this compact is dissolved by the Thyran side under the grounds you've presented, grounds that do not appear in the Galactic Charter's peace provisions, I have the right to bring the Veil contact file before the full assembly in open session. The access log already in the legal record establishes that the file exists and that its contents are known to an authorized party in this court. He paused. I don't want to use this. I came here so that nobody would ever have to. But I need this court to understand what it is deciding. The chamber's quiet had a specific density. Cathon let it last for the amount of time that his 37 years of reading rooms and people had told him was the right amount of time before he spoke. Then he said, whatever language appears in the compact, the fraudulent credential representing that secured its signing renders it void. The good faith requirement for the covenant's operative clauses requires honest dealing on both sides. He entered this court under false representation. The compact is invalid on those grounds. He looked at the legal bench. Praetor Yen can address the applicable precedent. Yen looked at the table in front of him for a moment. Then he said, the good faith provision does apply to the covenant's operative clauses. The question of whether the credential representation meets the threshold for invalidation is a legal determination that would require formal adjudication. He paused, with the quality of someone adding something they had prepared. The covenant's original language, however, predates the concept of credential representation in its current form. The pre-imperial framework used a different evidentiary standard for compact validity. He said this in the tone of someone making a factual observation whose implications were for others to address, and Cathon said, in the voice of a man who had read the room and found it requiring a different approach, Your Majesty. The security of this court requires this man's removal. Whatever the legal complications, the fundamental issue is what he is and why he is here. He looked at the Emperor. The compact can be litigated. This court's security cannot wait for litigation. The Emperor looked at Marcus. He looked at the compact. He looked at Cathon. He said, guards. They moved from the door positions. 4 of them, with the practiced efficiency of people trained to respond to that particular word from that particular voice. And Varys stood up. She had been sitting to Marcus's left for the duration of the session. She had not spoken. She had watched the proceeding with the focus of a scientist watching an experiment reach its critical phase, which was, in a sense, what she had been doing. She had spent the previous evening in the legal archive with the pre-imperial texts, and she had spent the night before that reading the Veil file. And she had spent the past 3 weeks watching her husband read 4,000-year-old documents in a dead language that no one else in this room spoke. She understood what she was about to do and why she was about to do it. And she had understood both of these things with sufficient time and clarity to be certain. She spoke in Old Thyron, formal Old Thyron, the ceremonial conjugation patterns and the specific vocabulary of the pre-imperial legal tradition, the kind that appeared in 2 places. The primary source texts that had remained in the archive because they couldn't be adequately digitized, and the ceremonial training that every member of the High Blood received from childhood as a matter of tradition and almost never used as a matter of necessity. She invoked the covenant of blood, not as dissolution, not as a petition. She invoked it as its pre-imperial design had intended, as the declaration of the High Blood Party that she stood as co-claimant to any petition arising from the compact, with all the legal standing of her bloodline attached to that claim. She was not doing this because the compact required it. She was not doing this because Marcus had asked her. She was not doing this because Counselor Death had advised it, or because her father had given any instruction. She was doing it because she had read the same texts and understood the same provision, and had, over the past 3 weeks, made her own decision about what she understood and what she chose to do with it. The guards stopped. Because arresting Marcus in this moment meant arresting a person whose legal standing had just been first affirmed by a member of the Imperial High Blood, standing in the Emperor's own court, invoking the oldest operative provision of Thyran civil law in front of the complete legal bench. And arresting Varys meant the Emperor was detaining his own daughter for exercising a legally recognized right, in a session held under Cathan's authority. In front of witnesses who were now part of the formal record, Cathan's expression did not change, it held. The stillness in it was the stillness of profound calculation encountering insufficient data, a state that his face had been trained, over 4 decades, not to display. But his left hand at his side opened and then closed and then went still in the manner of a hand that had nowhere useful to go. Marcus looked at Varys. She had watched his expressions for 3.5 weeks with the attention she brought to everything she studied. She had developed a working vocabulary of what his expressions meant. She had not encountered this one before. It was not strategic, it was not controlled. For the fraction of a second before the discipline reasserted itself, his face showed the specific expression of a person who has encountered a development that their planning did not account for, not frightened, not confused, but genuinely and completely unprepared. The expression of someone whose framework has just been extended past its designed edge, and who is a fraction of a second before they decide what to do about it. He had written 11 names on a piece of paper and left them on her desk. He had designed a plan in which her invocation of this covenant was the contingency for after his death, the option that passed to her if he didn't survive this room. He had made his specific kind of peace with that contingency. He had not designed anything for this. The Emperor looked at his daughter. The room waited for something to resolve. Cathan said very quietly to the aide at his shoulder, "Get me everything, the full surveillance record from the past 3 weeks. All of it. We are not done." The session recessed. It would reconvene the following morning. In the hours between, Varys sat in her chambers with Counselor Death, who had developed over 30 years of service the precise skill of understanding when his function was to advise and when it was to simply remain present. He remained present. He brought tea at some point. At another point, he read documents he had brought with him. She sat with her thoughts and did not find it necessary to perform anything for him, which was, she reflected, one of the functions of someone who had known you for long enough. Marcus was in the adjacent room. She could hear through the wall the faint rhythm of his working the small periodic interruption in the silence that happened when he put his pen down and picked it up again. She did not go in. He did not come out. This was, she understood, a kind of conversation they were having at a remove, 2 people in adjacent spaces who were each processing information about the same situation from different positions, and who had not yet found the words for the conversation that needed to happen after the session ended. At the 4th hour of the overnight cycle, she knocked on the connecting door. He said, "Come in." She came in. He was at the writing desk with the compact and the notebook and 2 archive volumes open, all of them tabbed and marked in his methodical way. He looked up when she entered and set down his pen with the motion of someone setting aside a task that would still be there later. She sat down in the chair across from the desk, the same position as the archive room, the same configuration as the conversation 3 days ago, which she was starting to understand might simply be the spatial grammar of how they talked to each other. She asked, "What happens in the morning?" "Cathan has surveillance recordings of this suite," he said. "He'll play them." "I know about the surveillance markers," she said. "I found them in the 3rd week and left them in place." He looked at her. Something adjusted in his expression, a small recalibration of an assessment he had been carrying. "That was careful," he said. "I know," she said. "What's in the recordings that concerns you?" "What's in them that concerns him," he said, "is the conversation in the archive room. My admitting to knowing about the veil file before the wedding. You're not reporting what you found. He'll present it as evidence of a conspiracy between us." He paused. What's in them that he doesn't know concerns him is that his own surveillance system captures all command-level communications at Valketh under the standard military archival protocol. He ordered the Vale mission in a command session in his suite 2 years ago. That session is in the archive. She was quiet for a moment. He's going to destroy himself, she said. Not intentionally, he said. By the same logic he used to build the surveillance. He created the system to catch me. He didn't account for the possibility that it would catch himself, because he built it from this assumption that he was the one doing the watching. He looked at the compact. He's very good at his job. He's been very good at it for a long time. But he made one mistake in the architecture of all of this. He assumed I didn't know he was recording, and he didn't ask himself what I would do if I knew. Did you know? I suspected. I've been careful about what I've said in audible range of the markers, she said. You have been 3 moves ahead of this situation since before you arrived. Mostly, he said, not entirely. She looked at him. Last night, she said, in the session, when I invoked the covenant. Yes, you didn't expect it. No, he said. Did you plan for any version of this where you were still alive at the end? The question sat in the room. He looked at her with the look that she had started to understand was his honest look, the one that didn't have the professional surface on it. That came out only when the professional surface was too much work, he said. No. She had known this was the answer. Knowing it as an inference and hearing it stated were, she found meaningfully different. The compact provision, she said. The names on the paper. The petition right if the compact was dissolved. You built all of those for after. Yes, you came here intending to die here. I came here intending to complete what I came to do, he said. I didn't plan to survive it, no. He was quiet for a moment. I stopped planning to survive individual missions 7 years ago. It wasn't fatalism. It was practical. You make clearer decisions when you're not allocating resources to your own continuation. She said, that is a very bad way to live. He said. Yes, she said. I need you to sleep. We have a session at 9th hour. I know, he said. She went back to her room. She sat at her desk with the 11 names on the paper and she read them through once more, from first to last in the order he had written them. Then she put the paper back in her inner pocket, where it would be in the morning. She did not sleep particularly well. She did not expect to. The morning session began with Cathan playing the recordings. He played them from the point in the archive room conversation where Marcus acknowledged knowing about the Vale file before the wedding. He played the section where Varys asked about the contract, and Marcus said something that needs to stay unread for a little longer. He played a selection of 4 additional conversations from the past 3 weeks, overheard discussions about the assembly session, a brief exchange in the corridor outside the legal archive, a conversation in the shared quarters that touched on the Covenant's operational structure. He assembled them into a sequence that built, piece by piece, the case for a premeditated intelligence operation conducted with the active knowledge and participation of a member of the Imperial High Blood. He was organized, he was precise. He made his presentation in the manner of someone who had spent the overnight hours structuring it, which he had, and who had confidence in its effect, which was evident. When he finished, Marcus said, "May I?" He was already moving before anyone responded. He walked to the playback console where the recording device sat, and he rewound the archive past the sections Cathan had selected, past the archive room, past 3 weeks of captured conversations. He went back 2 years, to a command suite briefing session in Cathan's own quarters, archived under the standard military protocol that recorded all command-level communications at the station as a matter of institutional record-keeping, a provision that had been in place for 60 years. A provision that no one had found occasion to raise in this particular session. He found the specific timestamp. He played it. Cathan's voice from 2 years ago said, "We designate this a Class 7 pre-contact capability assessment under Provision 12. Code Alpha Null. Authorization flows from this office under Commander's discretion. No assembly notification required under the 12 provision." A pause. The assessment window is 11 minutes on site. We want response time and resource deployment. Nothing more. Marcus stopped the playback. He said to the legal bench, Code Alpha Null does not exist in the Galactic Charter's approved contact framework. It is not a Class 7 designation under any current or historical charter provision. It is not covered under Commander's discretion in the 12 provision or any provision. Praetor Yen. He looked at Yen. I believe you have the archival reference. Yen said, that is correct. He had the specific quality of delivery of a person who had spent the overnight hours arriving at this statement and was now making it with precision. There is no Code Alpha Null in the Charter framework. The designation does not exist. Cathan said, that recording was obtained from a classified military archive. Marcus said, played in this session, in this chamber, under your authorization, Grand Admiral. You introduced recordings as evidence in an open proceeding of this court. The moment you did, you authorized the session's evidentiary record to include the scope of material available for playback from the same archive system. The system does not distinguish between the sections you selected and the sections you did not. He looked at the legal bench. I believe Praetor Yen can address the evidentiary basis. Yen said, that is correct. Cathan stood very still. Varys had, over 30 years of attending court proceedings of various kinds, developed a taxonomy of the specific ways people occupied stillness. There was the stillness of someone waiting. There was the stillness of someone listening. There was the stillness of someone running the calculation that comes after the last available move has been played and has not produced the required result. Cathan was in the last category. He was not broken by it. He was a person of genuine capability. 40 years of it. And what genuine capability did when it hit the structural limit of its available options was exactly what he was doing, reassessing with full remaining resources, which were no longer sufficient to change the position. He said, the recording does not alter the fundamental issue. A foreign operative entered this court under false representation. Whatever else is in the archive, the Emperor said, enough. The word was quiet. In the inner court, under the imperial seal, the Emperor's quiet voice had a specific weight that most voices never achieved at any volume. Cathan stopped. The chamber was still. The Emperor looked at Marcus. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Praetor Yen, who returned his gaze with the expression of a man waiting for a question he had already prepared the answer to. He looked at Cathan for a long moment, with the expression of a man performing a final accounting of something whose sum he had known for several minutes, and was only now confirming. He said, leave us. The court cleared, the legal bench's junior members, the witness gallery. Cathan's aides, the guards withdrew to the antechamber. The room narrowed to 5 people, Marcus, Varys, Yen, Cathan, and the Emperor. The Emperor looked at each of them in turn, and then said, to Marcus, in the direct register he used for statements rather than ceremony, what do you want? Marcus said, I want to go home. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the folded paper. Not her copy, his copy, the one he had been carrying since he arrived. He set it on the table between them and smoothed it flat. 11 names in his handwriting. He said, the names of 11 people belong in the Galactic Assembly's public record. The families of those people deserve to know what happened to them, not reparations, not a formal apology structured around political conditions, not recognition of wrongdoing if it comes with mechanisms attached, just acknowledgement. Their names in the record with the date and the location and the fact that it happened. He looked at the Emperor. I am willing to withdraw every petition right now. Return to Earth. Take nothing else. If those names are formally acknowledged in the Assembly archive. The Emperor looked at the paper. He did not touch it. He said, is that truly all? That is all I came here for, Marcus said. The Emperor looked at Cathan. Cathan said nothing. There was nothing in this configuration of the room that Cathan could say that would change what was in the recording, what was in the Compact's 7th appendix, what was in Yen's careful legal analysis, what was in Varys's invocation from the previous session. He had built a plan over several months with considerable skill and considerable resources, and the plan had failed because it had been built on an incorrect assumption about what the human across the table was capable of preparing. Yen, the Emperor said, what does the acknowledgement process require? Yen said, a formal statement of record submitted to the Assembly's historical archive under Imperial seal, noting the incident, the parties involved, and the date. It does not require admission of wrongdoing under current galactic law. It is, technically, a documentation action. The Emperor said, see to it. He rose from his seat. He said to Cathan, without looking at him, you will report to the military tribunal at 12th hour. The authorization record for the Veil mission will be submitted for formal review. He looked at his daughter for a moment, with an expression she recognized. It was the expression he used for things that had produced outcomes he had not foreseen, which he managed by acknowledging their existence and then moving the available resources accordingly. Then he walked out. Cathan left. Yen left. The antechamber guards withdrew. The room emptied until it held only Marcus and Varys and the table between them with a piece of paper on it. Marcus picked up the paper. He folded it carefully. He put it back in his pocket. He stood. He said, the embassy communication channel should be notified. There are people on Earth who have been waiting for information from this session. He moved toward the chamber door in the manner of a person who had a next task and was proceeding to it. Varys said, "You were going to leave." He stopped. "Without talking to me," she said. The conversation seemed to have reached its, "That is not what I asked you." He was quiet. He turned back. He did not come back to the table. He stood in the space between the door and the table, which was somewhere between departure and staying. She said, "You just withdrew every petition. You had the full assembly record available to you. You had the Covenant's petition, right? You had the legal standing to make Kethin's authorization record a galactic issue. And you traded it for 11 names in an archive." She was not criticizing him. She was locating something. "Did you plan for any version of this where you were still here afterward? Not survived, present, continuing." The silence ran for long enough that she understood it was honest rather than strategic. He said, "No. Did you plan for any version where I was a person and not a contingency?" The silence was longer. "And I was wrong. Not about what needed to happen, about how I treated you to make it happen." He said it in the level register he used for things that required precision. "I built a plan that required you to be available without your knowledge. That is not I have done things in my professional life that required keeping people uninformed about risks they were being exposed to. I have not liked any of those decisions. I do not like this one." He paused. "I should have told you sooner. I told myself there wasn't a right time to tell you. I think the honest version is that I didn't know how to tell you, and I made that into a logistical problem instead." She said, "You left 11 names on my desk." He waited. "You didn't ask me to do anything with them. You didn't tell me what they were for. You left them in case you couldn't speak for yourself and trusted that I would understand." She stood from her chair. "Do you know what that is in xenobiological terms, as a signal?" He said nothing. She said, "It is the highest trust marker measurable in interspecies interaction research. It means I am showing you something real that I would not show most people, and I am not asking for anything in return, because I trust you with it. Not because I calculated that trusting you with it would produce a useful outcome. Because I decided you deserved it." He said, "I didn't think I had the right to ask anything else from you." "I know," she said. "That is not the same thing as being right." She came around the table toward him, not fully across the space, but far enough that the table was no longer between them. "I studied humans for 4 years before this assignment. I read everything available. I believed I understood your species to a functional level." She paused. "I was wrong, and I know now what I was wrong about." He looked at her. She said, "Your species builds monuments to your failures, not to your victories. Every civilization I studied, every civilization in the galactic record, memorializes what it has accomplished. Your species builds memorials to the dead, including the dead you couldn't save, including the dead of your own mistakes, including people who were not heroes and whose deaths were not clean. You put their names in stone and you put their names in records and you carry their names in your pockets," she said. "I could not understand that when I read it. I understand it now. It is not pathology. It is the only thing I have encountered in this galaxy that looks like honesty about what cost actually means," he said, very quietly. "It's not a strategy, I know," she said. "That's exactly why it works." He stood in the space between the door and the table for another moment. Then he walked back to the table and sat down, not across from her, but at the adjacent position, the one that was neither the same side as her nor separated from her by the full width of the table. He put the notebook on the table between them. He did not open it. She sat down at an angle to him, close enough to see the top page through the cover, which showed the same cross-referencing notation in Old Thyran, and his own script that she had been watching him produce for 3.5 weeks. She said, "We should submit the acknowledgement together. Your petition, right, and my royal seal. It should come from both of us." He looked at her. "It will carry more weight in the archive," she said, which was true. She said it because it was also true that weight in the archive was not the only reason. He said, "All right," she said, "and then you can notify the Earth communication channel." He said, "Yes," she said, "and then we can have the conversation about the Compact's 5th section minimum tenure provision." He said, "I haven't read the 5th section as carefully as some other sections." "I know," she said. "I read it for you." She stood. 18 months. It requires a minimum of 18 months before either party can petition for dissolution. She looked at him with the expression she used for findings that were significant but not unexpected. "I found it 2 weeks ago. I didn't mention it at the time." He said, "No, you didn't ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You read contracts carefully. I learned from someone," she said. The assembly session was held 6 weeks later. The formal acknowledgement of the Kepler Station contact incident was submitted under Joint Imperial and Consort seal. Praetor Yen had noted, when preparing the submission, that this particular combination of signatories was unprecedented in the Assembly's 1,200-year record. He noted it in the procedural documentation without comment, which was his professional practice regarding things that had no existing category. The 11 names were read into the Assembly's public archive by the Chief Archivist in Galactic Standard and in English. The session was transmitted to Earth on the first live galactic feed ever received on a non-member world, in 12 cities across 4 continents. 11 families watched their screens and heard names they had been carrying alone for 7 years, spoken into an official galactic record. Grand Admiral Cathan appeared before the military tribunal. The proceeding lasted 4 months. He was removed from his position. The formal outcome was complicated and imperfect and politically managed in the way that outcomes involving senior military figures at the galactic level tended to be managed. It was not what anyone had specifically wanted. It was what the available facts, the available law, and the available political will produced, which was, Marcus had observed, usually the most honest description of how accountability actually worked. Earth was recognized as a provisional member world under the Assembly's Protection Charter. Not full membership, but the specific status that meant any action against Earth required Assembly review before proceeding. This was what Marcus had said he came to achieve. It was. Viewed from the position of an Earth that had entered first contact 7 years ago, with 11 people dead and no official acknowledgement. A meaningful difference from where they had been. Its marriage compact remained in effect. Neither party had petitioned for dissolution. The 5th section minimum tenure provision was noted by Praetor Yen in his filing without additional comment. 3 months after the Assembly session, a supply convoy crossed the outer lane markers of the Valkath system on its standard transit route, 3 cargo ships in formation, their running lights small and methodical against the outer dark. Varys and Marcus stood together at the primary viewport of the station's upper ring and watched them pass. The station had a particular rhythm at this hour, a quality of the environmental system cycling through its morning configuration, and the sound of it had become, over the months, something she had started to hear as ambient rather than mechanical. She asked, "What do you do now?" he said. "The treaty requires a human diplomatic presence in the Thyran court for the full duration of the peace compact." "That's standard language." She said, "I wrote that clause." He turned to look at her. She was watching the convoy. She said, "You're not the only one who reads contracts carefully." He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same space that a laugh would have occupied. The sound of someone encountering something they had not expected in a direction they had not been looking. She kept her eyes on the convoy and did not look at him while it was happening. He deserved that. Everyone deserved at least one thing that didn't have to be witnessed. The 3 ships moved through the outer dark and crossed the lane marker and were gone. The system's 3 suns were beginning their morning rise in the triangular arrangement that the cultural briefing had identified as auspicious, occurring by astronomical calculation once every 17 years. This was the 2nd time Marcus Cole had seen it. She was, as far as she knew, the only person who understood that this was true. She thought about saying this out loud. She decided it could wait. There was time. Now, there was 18 months of minimum tenure provision and a peace compact of indeterminate length and a joint submission to the Galactic Archive under both their seals. And there was more than enough time for the first time since this began, to say things when the right moment arrived rather than when the available moment required. The Galactic Assembly's Intelligence Analysis Division filed an updated assessment of humanity 14 months after the signing. The document classified under Alpha Restricted, which meant it was available to Varys through her research authorization. She read it in full. The assessment described the human species as statistically unprecedented in 3 parameters: their rate of exhaustive legal review in diplomatic contexts, their demonstrated operational effectiveness under conditions classified by most galactic species as unacceptably high personal risk, and what the document called, in a phrase she found both technically accurate and slightly inadequate, the functional integration of anticipated mortality into long-range strategic planning frameworks. The analysts had run their models 16 different ways and had produced 16 different assessments that all resolved to the same conclusion, which the document stated at the end in a single sentence: the predictive capacity of current galactic's strategic models is insufficient to account for species behavior that incorporates individual mortality as an operative planning variable rather than a constraint. The document did not say they were afraid. Intelligence assessments as a professional practice did not use the word afraid. But she had read enough of them to know what afraid looked like in the language they used instead. The Empire was not afraid of Marcus's weapons. It was not afraid of Earth's military capability, or its galactic political standing, or any specific threat that could be named and measured and assigned a probability. It was afraid of something quieter and more difficult, a species that had, for the entire span of its history, prepared for the worst outcomes it could imagine, and had done this so thoroughly and for so long that when the worst outcomes arrived, the humans inside them made decisions that no model had predicted and no framework had accounted for. She thought about what that meant, sitting with the assessment document in the early hours when the station was quiet. She thought about a man who had spent 3 years learning a dead language in preparation for a situation that did not yet exist. She thought about 11 names carried in a pocket through the center of the court of the people responsible for the deaths attached to those names and set down on a table at the end of it, and that being the only thing asked for. She thought about what her species had filed in its intelligence assessment under the heading of things to be afraid of. She thought about what they had gotten wrong in that filing and what they had, perhaps, gotten right, and whether the distinction would be visible from the position they occupied. She thought that it probably wasn't. The Thyron Empire would continue to file assessments. They would continue to use the alpha-restricted classification. They would continue to update their models and run their analyses and produce documents that tried to account for the human variable and that kept producing answers that didn't quite fit. They would do this with the methodical consistency of institutions that had survived for several thousand years by being thorough about the things that concerned them. They were still in every filing slightly behind.